You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics. National speaker Timmerie Millington has been a passionate advocate for life as long as she can remember, helping Gen X through Z answer the call to true feminism and authentic manhood. Timmerie holds a master's degree in biblical theology, and she covers this week's hottest stories from a Catholic worldview. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie.
Hello, hello. I have with me Father Tim Grumbach, one of your favorite guests here on Trending.
Oh, thank you. It's one of my favorite places to be.
Well, I was asking people the other day, what has been your favorite episode of Trending? What topic? And everyone goes, Father Tim. And they start posting pictures of Father Tim. We met him recently.
Yeah, I've been meeting people who listen to the show all over the place. I go and give talks at different places, and they say, we heard you with Timmerie. My parishioners, we heard you on the radio. They were surprised. My pastor has even been hearing, like, I hear you're on the radio. I'm like, oh no, what have I said? Hopefully nothing to incriminate. There's only wonderful things happening at the parish, and I hope I haven't made it seem otherwise. So.
Awesome. Well, Father Tim Grumbach, for those who do not know him, is an associate pastor at St. Augustine Parish in the Los Angeles Diocese, also volunteering his time on many projects apart from Trending, including Young Catholic Professionals, Life Teen, you name it. Any new ones going on right now?
Well, Culture Project is about to get back into town. I spent some time with them last year, and I'm just really excited that they do such great work all over Los Angeles.
Excellent. So please pray for him and his work. He's been a great aid, not only sharing his wisdom, but also the sacraments with us through his priesthood. Today, we're talking about a number of issues, especially having to do with the topic of mental health, discernment. We'll be talking a little bit about this transgender issue. You name it, we'll be talking about it later on, including the long-term impact, even after you take birth control, for teenagers who take birth control while they're developing. Stay tuned. You want to hear more on this, a recent study that came out. Father Tim, there's this culture surrounding many people of immobility. We don't move. We don't make decisions. We kind of just wait for stuff to happen. In the meantime, every single voice has some sort of influence because the world's always willing to tell you what to do. Yet there was a tweet that was sent to me about a month ago by Christine Roselle, who is a correspondent for EWTN and Catholic News Agency. And she kind of gave this warning that she's going to have an unpopular opinion here. And she talks about essentially this quote-unquote culture of discernment that permeates within the Catholic young adult circle and how it's basically killing vocation. And she's not talking only about religious vocations, but marital relations, not yet, not till you're married, marital vocations as well. And I loved her perspective because she's saying, she said things like, well, the seminary and convent don't own your life. They're not the army. And a date lasts at most maybe a few hours. And after that, move, do something is what she's saying essentially here.
Yeah, I can say from personal experience that the seminary could probably use a little bit more of that ascetic discipline, sort of an army sort of preparation. Although it is not signing your life away once one enters into the seminary, enters into discernment with the convent. It's a time of preparation. It's a time of discernment. But the thing is, you can't discern more than one thing at a time. And so some people will think, well, can I enter into the seminary or preparation for the convent, but also be dating someone? And that wouldn't be fair to them. It wouldn't be fair to the seminary or the convent, and it wouldn't be fair to yourself. And so discernment is a tightrope to walk on in a sense, but you have to be careful thinking that you're going to be signing your life away on the first day. No, it's a time of preparation.
Yeah, it's a time of preparation. I think people have this difficult time where once they kind of go in one direction, first of all, they're not willing to take the first step, but then once they head in that direction, they think that is absolutely where they will be. Yeah, anyone who's gone to college knows that they end up changing their majors and so forth many times, and often don't even end up working in the field that they studied. But I think a little secret to living life and kind of going through the rhythm of things is you've got to try stuff out, and you have to be willing to recognize, like, you may hit a wall and you may think it's a failure, but that's just a sign you're supposed to go in a different direction.
That's right. We have to learn how to fall. We have to learn how to fail in the Christian life. There's something so radically Christian about that idea of falling and getting back up, is that, I know from my experience of, crashing my bikes getting almost knocked out by surfboards and all the stuff that my mom hates that I do. I've learned that you have to learn how to fall. If you're going to ride your bike, you have to learn how to fall, or you're going to break something every time. And you're surfing, you have to learn how to fall, or you're going to lose your breath every time you hit the water. And you kind of need that. So in the Christian life as well, and especially in discernment, I've always thought that I'm terrible at discernment, because the way I've always done it was just jump in both feet first and let God sort it out.
Okay, and when you said that, we were talking about this on the phone the other day, and I was saying, Father, I'm the same way. Like, I jump in, and if I screw up, I screw up, and it's not like we're jumping into bad things. We're jumping into good things. Maybe taking on too much. Maybe not having boundaries. Maybe that might be our problem. But if you are living a sacramental life, as my mom, I remember, always said when I was younger, like, if you're staying close to the sacraments, if you're being prayerful, yes, you may not choose the perfect path and do exactly what God wanted you to do, but you'll still be making good decisions, and you'll learn from the lessons from having followed maybe lesser paths.
And one of the foundations of discernment is not that you're choosing between a good and a bad. We should, in our conscience, be able to choose relatively easily between the good and the bad. Whether or not we choose to act on it, that's where temptation comes in. But discernment at its foundation should be the choice between two goods, sometimes almost equal goods. Sometimes lesser and greater, but discernment is about choosing between two goods. And so it's not God setting us up necessarily every time we have to make a decision. Is married life evil and the priesthood a good thing, or vice versa?
Right.
Rather, it's how can your gifts and your talents, but also your deepest needs and your longings, reach out to the deepest needs and the longings of the world around you? And how does God want to love you, and so let his love overflow into your vocation?
Well, you just hit on two really good points. One, that the option should never be between good versus evil, because we should be formed enough to be able to say, no, this actually isn't even an option. It's off the table. Yeah, that might be easier, but it's not even an option. And unfortunately, a lot of people aren't in that place, but we are called to be. And so what is getting in the way of you getting to the point where the bad options are off the table? But then two, you talked about kind of this idea of freedom. I'll never forget a dear friend of mine when he was discerning the priesthood, and he finally reached a point where he recognized he could go and start a family and be a father. He was free to do that. He didn't have to be a priest. And it was kind of like this light bulb moment where he recognized, I'm free. I can choose. And he ended up becoming a priest.
And I think another key to discernment, other than just it's between two goods rather than a good and an evil, is that the dangerous word of mediocrity is falling into this space of constantly discerning, where one spends so much time discerning that they never make a decision, right? The decision is a pretty important part of the discernment. And to fall into this culture of discernment, which never makes a decision, that ultimately leads to a mediocrity.
Well, it sounds boring.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry, and someone may be listening and say, wow, that's kind of mean, but no, it sounds absolutely boring, because we learn from mistakes. We learn from hardship. Maybe you want to, go off and start your own company. Maybe you want to take a job that gives you a little bit smaller of an income, but you really like the job, but it's going to be a little challenging. Maybe you want to, come home and take care of your kids and transition to a single income. It's going to be hard, but it's fun when you allow the challenge to enter into your life.
And the spiritual tradition of the church will call this acedia. And sometimes we'll translate that as laziness or sloth.
Yes.
But the monastic tradition of the church really looks at acedia and says it's more so a sadness while in the presence of that which should bring us the greatest joy.
Wow, I want to come back on that in a second. That's Father Tim Grumbach. If you're just joining us, you are listening to Trending with Timmerie. And you guys follow us on Instagram. You can find me at Timmerie, and you can find Father Tim at Father Tim. I think it's an underscore. We tag him.
You'll find me.
You'll find him. I tag him on my page. We're live on Instagram and Facebook. We would love to stay in contact with you throughout the week. Father Tim, you mentioned this acedia and kind of this laziness where people are at, yet it's a sorrow in the presence of good. I think this is where a lot of people are at. There's a sorrow because they might have a friend who's in a good place. They might have a friend who has something they want, and there's a sorrow that they have over it. But then this jealousy enters in, and I feel like a lot of the time the people end up just being cruel and mean because they're just so unhappy.
Yeah, one of the greatest examples we could look at is actually during these masses this week, we're hearing from the book of the prophet Jonah.
Yes.
And he's such a perfect example, if you ask me, of this acedia, because the consequences of this spiritual lethargy, this sadness in the presence of what should make us happiest, is you have someone like Jonah who first is that he's kind of looking at mediocrity. He's paralyzed because he does not want to go to Nineveh. God calls him to go to Nineveh, and we've always thought and sometimes preached, it's because he was afraid to take on such a great calling. No, it's because he hated the Ninevites. He wanted to see God destroy them. And so he didn't trust God, and so he found himself in this paralysis where he could not go and do what God wanted him to do. So what does he do? Is that he gets bitter. There's this bitterness towards God, and then coming out of this resentment, he turns tail and runs the other direction. And so what we have here, because of acedia, this spiritual sadness, he should have been exalting that God wanted to forgive the most evil people in the world. These Assyrians who had been destroying nations and destroying Israel. But instead, he has this paralysis, and so he becomes resentful, and then there's this agitation in him, and he goes seeking everything elsewhere, distracting. I mean, this happens in our discernment as well, as we get bitter that God is asking us something, so we find distractions and resentment at the people who are already married or the people who are already priests, and this bitterness and this envy builds up in our hearts, and that's what happened to Jonah, and I think that's what is one of the most dangerous things of this constant discernment without making decisions.
Well, and we have to remember, God is chasing us down. I think that's another part of the story of Jonah. God chases him down. He's trying to run. He's bitter. He's pulling away from the mission God has given him. But God truly does chase us down. And he may be subtle, but that subtleness is not so subtle if you are choosing to try and follow him. So we'll be coming back talking kind of in the similar range of discernment, entering now into a little more deeper issues having to do with suicide. We'll also be talking in just a bit about the long-term impact of birth control and its connection to mental health. We'll be right back.
Timmerie will be right back. Send her a tweet at Timmerie. That's TIMMERIE. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, where morality and culture meet, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics.
Hello. Timmerie here with Father Tim Grumbach in studio from the Diocese of Los Angeles, working there at St. Augustine Parish as the associate pastor. We want to talk about a little more difficult of an issue, and it's really multifaceted. And I want to start, for those who are just joining us, by sharing, I know how difficult this issue of suicide is. My own family has faced some of the most tragic circumstances surrounding a suicide as well. And so I hope people understand that when we're bringing the Catholic Church's perspective on this issue, it's not lightly, but it's really trying to seek a path forward, honestly, having to do with our salvation. So for those who don't know, there is a young man, 30 years old, by the name of Jarrid Willson, who committed suicide just a couple weeks ago. He was 30 years old, a father and a husband of 2 little boys. He's the second pastor, in fact, in the last year to commit suicide, who's also another father of a mega church pastor. And I'm looking at this, and the story is heartbreaking, but what stood out to me about it is how a lot of people of faith keep saying, I know that he is with Jesus, and they keep commending the great parts of who he is, which is great, but they're forgetting the fact that he left a wife and children behind and created a great scandal for the community.
Yeah, some of our Christian brothers and sisters have really lost a very important and deep language of the purgation, the purgatory, the purification that can still happen after a life is over. And to be without that language, one may jump immediately. And this is, comes from a place of hope. I'm convinced that it does come from a place of Christian hope, that God does not lose souls, that he still loves these people who've taken their own lives more than we possibly could. It comes from that place of hope. But not being able to speak of the language of this person still needs our prayers, this person still needs some purification to prepare themselves to meet Jesus, and to skip immediately to that language of, he's done this thing that's hurt us and hurt himself, and it most likely did come from a place of maybe clinical depression, and so that took away some of their culpability, and we understand that through Catholic moral theology, and yet they're unable to speak of this language of we don't know where he is, and that brings us sadness and grief, And being unable to even speak of that grief and that need for purification, it takes away a very important part of the grieving process.
And I think that's the most painful element of having a loved one who's committed suicide is we actually don't know where those individuals are. We have no idea. Yet we're called, and we read in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, if you ever have any questions about this, there are a couple of fantastic paragraphs, paragraph 2280 through 83, and it talks essentially about how essentially there should be hope that God can offer this person the opportunity to be saved by his means. There may be some opportunity. It doesn't say guarantee. It refers to an opportunity that can occur. And it really points back to the fact that we as the church, we as the people have to pray for this individual and for the people who are scandalized by it. And it also talks about how that's part of the problem is that it also creates scandal for the community. It rejects the love of self and it rejects the love of neighbor. It also rejects the love of God in the act of suicide. And this is an issue we have to talk about. You know, Father Tim, we're seeing this rise in suicide nationwide. It is in particular an epidemic among men. And just this last year is an example of this with 2 young pastors, 30 years old, who left behind a wife and children. It's devastating. And what's interesting is that Jarrid Willson himself actually worked with the people who experienced severe mental health issues and even founded organizations surrounding the issue.
Yeah, and while the issue of suicide is so pertinent to this and we so need to talk about it, and there are a lot of people who are talking about it more and more, and they're making their own struggles known, and that's so important, but you know, maybe at the root of this is that idea of mental illness and drug addiction and these other things that the Catechism does say that it may diminish the responsibility of the one who commits suicide. But it also, you know, the very next sentence reminds us not to despair of their eternal salvation because, as you said, you know, God can take care of them in ways that we could not. And, you know, I've just personally and honestly over the last few days have been encountering more and more people out on the streets nearby my parish. I don't have to go far to find homelessness, and I look at that and I say, the issue really isn't at its root. There's not enough homes. There's so much mental illness out on the streets right now.
Right.
So much drug addiction, and just over the last few days, I was called to the hospital, up to the psych ward, and or whatever you wanted to call it, and just meeting these people who've been. I've been trying to put it into the right words, and my first thought was like, these people have been broken by the culture. Mm-hmm. But that's not right, because that's almost making it too easy on us, is to say, the culture did it. But people break people.
Right.
And that's where a lot of drug addiction comes in. Mental illness is a different story, but it can have its origins in how a child is raised and their experiences growing up. But I'm seeing broken people on the streets, and not even on the streets, they're coming into the church and they're sleeping in our pews. And so often I only meet them because they come near to me, but how often am I going near to them? That's been really challenging me these last couple of weeks. And I think that needs to be said when we're looking at the people who are suffering from these tendencies towards suicide, the people who are struggling with depression. Are we going out to look for them? Or are we waiting for them to make some great act, or waiting for them to reach out?
That's Father Tim Grumbach. You were listening to Trending with Timmerie. If you or anyone is struggling with mental illness, or whatever struggle it might be, pulling you into depression, anxiety, and more serious issues from PTSD, you name it, we do have incredible resources with CatholicTherapist.com. In fact, 2 of those therapists who are part of that network we have here regularly on Trending, they come with all the science and knowledge from psychology and sociology and bring in a distinctly Catholic perspective that is so beneficial when healing the mind. And I think that, Father Tim, when you were talking a second ago, you were talking about how sometimes we can blame the culture. And I want to challenge all of us. We have all been surprised by the people in our lives who have committed suicide, or by the people who are struggling with severe depression. I think part of the struggle is that we live in a culture where we are literally frying our brains. And this is where I think it really connects to current culture and issues, whether it's the young woman who's been pressured or who's caved into engaging in sexual intimacy and it has weighed severely upon her mind, whether it's a person who is abused drugs and fried their brain in such a way, or alcohol, who has consumed porn and has rewired their brain, who has experienced some form of sexual, emotional, or verbal abuse, manipulation. All of these issues are also a sign of the breakdown of the family. And so when we're bringing these various issues up, it's important that there's a lot of healing that has to take place in the culture. And that's why the resource of Catholic therapists, catholictherapist.com, I think is a great aid in helping to heal the culture, because it goes beyond prayer. We need prayer, but we also need intervention of human people who are trained to help us.
Yeah, that was one of the messages of Jarrid. I think it was almost like the evening that he actually took his life was out on social media. He was saying that just praying to Jesus won't cure your mental illness. Just praying to Jesus won't, cure this, these suicidal tendencies. Yet we recognize that just psychology won't heal it either. Is that we are, a person in the deepest sense of the meaning of the word. Is that we are body and soul, and our mind is connected to both of those with a proper Christian anthropology and understanding of the human person with the Christian worldview. So to have Catholic therapists who can help out and to understand that they're treating a whole person, that's really, really key to those who are struggling with these thoughts of suicide, to people who are struggling with mental illness. So please, don't be afraid to do more than pray. Prayer is key, prayer is important, but just like the paralytic who was brought before Jesus, he could not get to Jesus on his own. He needed his friends to carry him. And so, there's a story told about a priest who was preaching at a funeral of a young man. I don't remember if it was he took his own life or he died in some great tragedy, but he wasn't a perfect young man. He was he had his troubles, but he was a good young man. But his friends gathered together at the funeral and were joking and laughing and having a great time and remembering all the great and funny things that this young man had done in his life. And the priest very seriously said, "We don't know if this young man is in heaven or hell, but you must be the friends of this paralytic. You must carry him. So pray, fast, sacrifice for the good of his soul, because his story is not done yet." And it was just a really powerful reminder that we need one another. We belong to one another. And as Mother Teresa would often say, is that the reason there's no peace is because we've forgotten that we belong to one another.
Another perspective on this story that I'd like to throw in here, Father, you sent this to me. It's from the Journal of American Medical Association. It's a journal showing how we found there's actually a group of people who have been resilient to suicide. 0 suicides among this test group, and it is actively Catholic women who are attending Mass more than once a week. Their suicide rate is 0. And for those women who are going to Mass once a week, more devoutly, we see that, in fact, Protestant women have a 7 times more higher suicide rate than actively Catholic women. So what they're showing is that not only does faith matter, but specifically the Catholic faith matters.
Yeah, which points to the reality that, again, you can't just pray this, pray mental illness away. Jesus can work certain miracles, yes, but and simply walking into a church every Sunday isn't going to do it. What they realized in this study seems to be that these women, it wasn't just about going to Mass on Sundays. It was about being transformed week in and week out by the grace of the Eucharist, in order to live a life that desires to be self-giving, desires to pour oneself out. So it's hard to say just from this research, just from this study, that go to Mass and you'll be perfectly okay. But we believe that the grace of the Eucharist does help us carry certain crosses that we wouldn't be able to otherwise.
And it challenges you grow in your faith, because we can go through the motions of Mass and it means nothing. I mean, that's easy. Just zone out, be present. But how can you go deeper to invest for greater mental health for yourself and the influence you have on others?
You can listen to more of Trending via the podcast on iTunes or the iHeartRadio app, where you can share your favorite episodes. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie.
A shout out to our new sponsor here on Trending, Solidarity HealthShare. For those who aren't aware, Solidarity HealthShare is supporting here Trending with Timmerie. And for those who don't know, Solidarity HealthShare is very simple. They help members pay for affordable and quality health care. They're working within the community, showing that there are eligible medical expenses, everything from medical treatment surrounding your regular health care costs to NaPro Technology, natural family planning. You even have the option of choosing your health care providers. And at Solidarity HealthShare, they're dedicated to faith and are committed to care. For more information, you can visit solidarityhealthshare.org. Again, that's solidarityhealthshare.org. Father Tim, we've been talking about this theme of mental health and in typical trending style here. We often take up difficult moral issues, and today, hormonal contraception, we know, has had a major influence on the culture from the perspective of taking sex outside of marriage and therefore allowing for the baby to be destroyed through abortion, because now babies are considered an accident. Safe sex is considered protected sex, which is completely wrong. And so I want to talk about this new study that came out from actually the University of British Columbia, and it was published in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, and it was showing that essentially for women who, should I say teenagers, who have taken birth control during their adolescence as they're still developing, that this hormonal, sex hormone replacement, really kind of manipulation, has essentially led to increased long-term impact of depression and actually altering the brain even years after the contraception is taken.
Yeah, and manipulation, is such a key word there. Because it's not healing something that's wrong with the body most of the time. There will be some doctors who will give birth control to, normalize some functions, but for the most part, it's manipulation of something that should be working healthily, and that's not good for the body when you've taken something that is working healthy and shutting it down.
When we're looking at this whole issue surrounding depression, we talk about how a contraceptive lifestyle can be a depressing lifestyle. We'll come to that in a bit. But staying on the focus here, they're showing that women who have taken birth control as a teenager, as an adolescent still developing, are 1.7 to 3 times more likely to be depressed than women who are adults who take birth control, which already have a higher likelihood of depression.
And we're seeing more and more research done, young people at this age range, and the development of their brains, and how a woman's brain will develop, more quickly than a young man's will. But we see not just in this matter of artificial contraception, but even the gender transition, for
Yes.
young people, is that their bodies are not formed and their brains are not yet fully formed or functioning. And so to introduce something so foreign to the body will be fighting back, and that puts tremendous strain not just on the physical part of the body, but the mental part of the young person.
Well, that's a really interesting point. So in the study, it talks about, in the end, essentially the people who published it, about how they're still for contraception and women's choice and yada, 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 a typical very pro-abortion stance.
Major global health priority.
Major global health priority. This is what, contraceptive and reproductive rights are. But then it does say, so although they're still supporting birth control use, they're saying we do hope that people will be more informed in dialogue and decision making. I just think, what a lie. These are the types of studies that end up being hidden because people are so pro this agenda for hormonal contraception, quote unquote reproductive health, that no one's telling that 13-year-old girl that she is damaging her brain for life. Even
the language that's used here, talking about the use of oral contraceptives, is that it's particularly popular among teenagers. Like the latest music, like Netflix, it's particularly popular among teenagers. But just the use of that language is it's very weaponized, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, and this is what I think is encouraging the mindset. Well, why wouldn't you be taking birth control? Even if you're not sexually active, we should put you on the pill. This is what your peers say. This is what your doctors say. This is what parents are saying. And so this is the realm of confusion that teenagers feel like, oh, this is something everyone's doing. I should be doing it too. And in fact, we can have doctors, at least in the state of California, putting teenagers on birth control at about 12, 13 years old. And the parent doesn't even have to be involved in that conversation. And yet, Father Tim, it's going against a very grain of research we see. We've seen that in animal studies, countless animal studies, when there has been sex hormone replacement that has had an influence on the behavior and is irreversible after the fact, even if it's no longer being taken.
Yeah. Well, we are most certainly seeing the fulfillment of certain prophecies, one could say, of the church's teaching against artificial contraception. And while the church's teaching was focused at the time so much on married couples and their use of contraception within marriage, now we have to speak of it in the language of teenagers, of adolescents, and the effects it's having on them. I know before that we have talked about that great encyclical Casti Connubii. That was Pius XI, I believe. Yes, 1930. It was right around the time that the Anglican Communion and the Lambeth Conference of 1930 gave permission for, I forget exactly the language, it was ambiguous enough as it was in certain situations or something like that.
For married couples to suddenly start using birth control.
Right. And Pope Pius XI, his language was so very strong in that, pointing back to an earlier encyclical, I believe it was Leo XIII, and how, for so long, ever since the advent of this artificial contraception, the church has recognized the danger it can have on relationships. But now we're looking at not just the relationships, but the danger it's having on the human person, body and soul. And looking at adolescents, I don't know if when they were writing these encyclicals, they'd imagine that they would, the church would one day have to speak out against the use of it for non-married adolescents. It's incredible.
That's Father Tim Grumbach. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. Shout out again to our sponsors at Solidarity. You can learn more about alternative options to healthcare at solidarityhealthshare.org. Father Tim, I want to share a little story here. When I was working in the crisis pregnancy centers, I did not counsel often. I did a lot of the education, other things behind the scene. But one time we had a young girl who had gone through a crisis pregnancy a number of years ago. And she was now, continuing to do follow-up with the center because let me tell you, crisis pregnancy centers are in it for the long haul. They maintain relationships with those girls for a very long time. And this young woman was getting ready to marry the father of her child that had been saved from abortion. And one day I go into the counseling room with her and I think, okay, well, it's time to talk to her about birth control. It was kind of my task for the day. And I didn't know if she had any religious background. I personally didn't know a ton about her. And so I kind of went starting a conversation, trying to kind of find out what worldview does she come from. And eventually I end up discovering she's Catholic. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean anything all the time. But I ended up asking her if she knew anyone who had taken hormonal contraceptives because I know that that's something that she might be considering now that she's getting married. And she ends up just spilling. I don't even have to say anything about her own family member and how they weren't taking hormonal contraceptives. But once her sister did end up taking it, the relationship between her sister and brother-in-law changed. And how from then on out, he really started to degrade her. And his treatment of her was so belittling. And I said, well, why do you think that is? And I remember we ended up coming to the conclusion, predominantly with her own words and me just asking questions, that essentially he began to use her, to view her as an object. And without even outright saying, this is what the church teaches, I waited till later to find out she was Catholic and really cared about her faith. I said, we're called to be open to life. It's a natural part of how we engage in sexual intimacy. It's a part of what happens. And when you use contraceptives, there's depression, there's anxiety, there's blood clotting, but then there's also this relational interpersonal dynamic that breaks the couple. And I said, sexual intimacy is supposed to be completely unitive. And that means that there should be no barrier. And I said, could you see how when we put a barrier, whether it be a condom or this intellectual barrier of contraception trying to prevent something, that there's a wall that goes up between the two people? She got it. And I said, well, actually, you mentioned you're Catholic. And I then shared the information. And she got it from a social perspective, an interpersonal and a religious perspective. These are the conversations we're called to have with people.
Yeah, you're speaking about the contraceptive mentality. That's the term that the church has been using for some time. And it doesn't refer only to the relationship between married couples. I can tell you that I've been challenged before to look at my own priesthood and the ways that I might view it in a contraceptive mentality of when I choose to be fruitful as opposed to when God chooses to be fruitful. And that's a frightening thought, that it can creep into any relationship that we have, is that we hold ourselves back from being a gift to the other, and so bringing new life into the world. And so that's why the church has always been adamant that in the married life, that there is just no place for this contraceptive mentality, because that was part of the prophetic language of Humanae Vitae from Paul VI, is that the man could so very much begin to use the woman, and it would also lead the couple to see the child as merely a consequence of their pleasure with one another.
A consequence that can be wasted away.
Right. And when a child becomes nothing more than just a consequence that could be wasted away, that could be thrown away, that could be ended before it's even brought into this world, then that is going to greatly damage the chastity among the couple. Because we will be talking about this later, this idea of chastity. It's not just about this great no to sex. It's about this greater yes to the love which is expressed through the sexuality. And the Catechism uses such beautiful language that it's the school of self-gift. It's where we learn how to become more like Christ.
And this is where we battle of finding that we're not giving in to pride and into pleasure that is predominant among that contraceptive ideology. And people think that, well, we need to talk about abortion. But let me tell you, people who are pro-life are allowing a pro-abortion mindset to set in as they are permissive in their own lives and the lives of others for contraception.
Timmerie will be right back. Send her a tweet at Timmerie. That's TIMMERIE. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, where morality and culture meet, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics.
So just a couple months ago, I was in Alabama. I headed over to a coffee shop, and as I was meeting with a friend of mine there, he looked at the barista as he was checking out and said, "Thank you, ma'am." And when he said, "Thank you, ma'am," she looked at him and very, should I say, disrespectful toward a customer, ends up saying, "Well, why would you call me ma'am?" And he is absolutely flabbergasted by the whole thing and says, "Well, you're a woman and I'm being respectful of you. And, it's a term of some honor, and I call pretty much all women ma'am to show respect for them." Said something along those lines. Well, I'm not a woman. And just very rude in the dialogue. And from there on out, the rest of the transaction is actually quite disrespectful in how it occurs. And I was just sitting there, surprised. Okay, bring the Californian to Alabama and boom, this is what happens. But it was interesting because the gentleman I was with was completely shocked. He had never experienced anything like that before. I was shocked by the rudeness of the dialogue, not so much by the content of it coming from California and the insanity of this transgender issue. But this isn't the first time we're seeing conversations like this actually getting even worse.
Yeah, we got to be careful with our language now, don't we? We were just chatting on the phone yesterday, was it? And I said the word gal when I was talking about a lady who's helping us at the parish. And that, my mom grew up in Michigan, and some of her Midwestern language got passed on to me. I was saying we used to call soda pop when I was growing up, and so some people might say gal and mean something I don't know, derogatory by it, but that's something that, when I'm speaking respectfully of a woman, sometimes I'll say that word. And our attempt to be respectful to people is being thrown back in our faces at times now, isn't it?
Well, and look at how disrespectful they are. They can't respectfully interact with a customer. And this is what's interesting to me, Father Tim. If I disagree with someone, unless they are threatening me in my face, I'm going to try to be polite to them. In fact, I should even try to, if I have the opportunity, maybe even build some sort of relationship with them. I remember debating a feminist professor, a very pro-abortion feminist professor at Cal State San Marcos. And, people who disagreed with her would want to villainize her. I sat there before and after talking to her for a while, because the reality is that we may disagree on an issue, but we should be able to have relationships with people we disagree with, because that's how we build bridges and change things.
Right. And it's a matter of obedience to the commands of Christ. When someone strikes you on one cheek, give them the other. And I'm thinking right now, just because of that, the difference between tolerance and love, and also the following the commandments of Christ. I'm thinking about this story I just read about the Desert Fathers, where this great and holy hermit had kind of come into town for some reason or another, and there was a young woman there who was possessed by a demon and came up and slapped him on his cheek. And so what did he do? He didn't yell at the demon, yell at the girl. He turned his other cheek. And the demon says, "Oh, he's following the commands of Christ. I've been vanquished." And so, to follow the commands of Christ is something that can, vanquish the demonic in our society still. But we will try to use the weapons of this world to fight back and to argue back at times. And, there's a place for debate and a place for clarification. But what if we, took a little bit more seriously some of the commands of Christ? Like, should you call your brother a fool, you'll be liable to the Sanhedrin. Should you call him Rakai, you will be liable to fiery Gehenna. Is how are we correcting those in error? How are we responding to those who will, either literally or figuratively slap us on the cheek? Do we do it by following the commands of Christ? And so in obedience to the command of Christ, casting out certain demons of our culture.
Let's talk about the topic of tolerance. There's another example, not just my own. And what's interesting before we mention it is I remember in that situation after the gentleman I was with explained why he called her ma'am, we just remained silent. We finished the transaction. She did not like, anything we ordered at that point. Everything we ordered was complicated. And that's a moment, okay, just remain silent. Let them have their day. And I think that sometimes that's the most respectful thing to do. But here's an interesting example. I was reading a story online. I think this happened, in fact, a couple weeks ago. There was a story of a young woman who had gone into a coffee shop, I believe in Nebraska, and she worked for Nebraska Family Alliance. It was a Maryland Sneak, actually, as I'm looking at the name. And she would go there every Monday, I believe, would go to this cute little shop. It would be how she'd start her week. And one day the barista came up to her and ended up yelling at her, saying the F word multiple times, saying, "I recognize who you are and how dare you." And apparently this person identifies as transgender and just tore into the customer, telling her to leave, that she's not welcome there, that they don't want to serve her. And it ended up making the news. And of course, the news ended up spinning it to somehow make it sound as if the person who was being yelled at and cussed at was the wrong person. But yet again, it shows that this idea of tolerance is not present among people who disagree with us. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what do we mean by tolerance, though? We were just talking about this, is there's a big difference between tolerance and love. Yeah. And it's been a big part of my preaching and my own experience in ministry is that I've not been called to be tolerant to people. I've been called to love people. And there's this great revolution happening in the culture, this revolution of tolerance. And yet what's missing is a revolution of love in truth. Right. They will use the word love, but I don't think they mean the same thing that we mean. I don't know if you know. I don't think you know what. I don't know what it is.
Well, I mean, if you look at it, tolerance is, and you said this to me yesterday, we're not called to be tolerant, we're called to be truthful with love. Mm-hmm. And that requires actually correcting people. That requires telling people the truth, not just saying, "Hey, well, you do you, that's totally fine." No, it's saying, actually, there's a reason why I am calling you a woman, because you look like a woman. You're interacting like a woman. I'm doing the best of my ability to be polite to you. In fact, I'm trying to be polite to you, whatever that might be. And sometimes our tolerance, or should I say our loving truth, is being silent at times so that we don't kind of create a big fight in the wrong situation. Right,
because tolerance, by its very nature, keeps people at an arm's length. Mm-hmm. Tolerance is something we do to them. It creates this barrier between us and the other people, in that we're not inviting them to come to be with us. We're saying, you can stay over there. You can stay the way you are. You don't need to change. We will tolerate you. Do you want to love your brother and sister, or do you merely want to tolerate them? Toleration is something we do to someone we can't stand.
But hold on a second. Yeah. By the way, that's Father Tim Grumbach. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. Think about tolerance. Sometimes we have to remember that a lot of the things we're discussing and behaviors we're supposed to show to our neighbor start at home. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, when I think of tolerance, if I'm tolerating myself, I'm tolerating some bad behavior I probably shouldn't be tolerating. And you said it yesterday, Purpose on the phone, like we're called to conversion. We are called to change. That is what the gospel message of Jesus Christ is about. We're called to repent and believe in the gospel. And how is tolerance repenting? And how is tolerance believing and changing in something other than ourselves?
And letting it be that, there's no us and them. What Jesus did on the cross, he did so that there's only us. And when we approach these situations, or they approach us, as it sounds like it did in this Alabama coffee shop, was the situation approached her. And was it a matter of her saying, there's me and then there's you over there, I'll keep you at an arm's length? Or was it this other person coming to her and projecting this onto her and saying, no, you're not even welcome here. I'm not even going to keep you at an arm's length. I'm just going to kick you out. And another thing that we were questioning as we were talking about this yesterday, about this story, was that this barista is a biological male who identifies as transgender.
Right.
I don't know if the research has been done, but it seems to me that there's still something innately built into a man, even though he may identify as transgender. I've been wondering about this. Is there a certain kind of a stronger tendency towards going on the offensive, of being protective in those biological males who identify as transgender? Is there going to be more aggressiveness still built into their character? So would this have been as verbally violent if it were a biological female identifying as transgender? I think it's an important question to ask, and I don't know if people have been asking that question, is that we believe that one's maleness and one's femaleness has an effect on your person in the deepest sense. So if one is denying that, that inherent maleness or femaleness, masculinity or the femininity, is it still going to be fighting its way to express itself, even though they are trying to express themselves differently? And
aggression is a natural part of who a man is. And we could go into a whole conversation about what aggression is, whether it's good or bad. But part of what it reminds me of is when Patrick Reedy was on the show with us a couple months ago, and we were talking about maleness and femaleness. He was talking about specifically with men, part of the great mission, and the fire that's within the man is to destroy what is evil in the world and build up what is good. And perhaps some of these men who are following false ideologies, for example, maybe they're living a transgender lifestyle, they're trying to destroy what they perceive as an evil and build up what they perceive as a good. And so they're still doing what is naturally ingrained on the masculine heart.
Yeah. And it can be said that when men interact with one another, they'll try to outdo one another. But it can also be said that sometimes when women interact in negative ways with one another, it won't be so much about excelling above the other woman. It will be about bringing that woman who's excelling down to their level. That's hard for me to say as a man, but that's my understanding. That, and I wonder if that's finding its way into this situation, even where it's still built into a man, a biological man, to destroy what they see as evil. And so this kind of aggression comes out. And there's still an inherent maleness that is expressing itself.
Thank you for spending time with us. You can find Father Tim Grumbach at Father Tim Grumbach. All of his episodes are at radiotrending.com, along with all links to his social media platforms from Instagram to Twitter. I hope you follow me as well at Timmerie. That's Timmerie.
This has been Trending with Timmerie. To book her to speak or learn more about her guests, visit radiotrending.com. That's radiotrending.com. You can listen to more of Trending via the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or the iHeartRadio app, where you can share your favorite episodes.